Hi, and welcome to the Games and Social Justice Public Lecture Series. My name is Biz Neidham, and I'll be your host for this afternoon's programming. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting in person on UBC's Point Grey campus, which is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. This programming today was very much inspired by my work in Indigenous studies as I strove to find ways to connect the goals of truth and reconciliation with my research and teaching in popular media. I hope many of you will continue to attend this lecture series over the next 3 months to learn more about how looking at the intersection of games and social media can foster discourses on Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. Today's programming is embedded in my 4th year Bachelor of Media Studies seminar and sponsored by the Popular Media for Social Change Research Excellence Cluster, otherwise known as the Pop Culture Cluster. The Pop Culture Cluster serves as an interdisciplinary hub for the evaluation of popular media and its impacts in higher education and beyond, and seeks to identify the role of popular media in illuminating and catalyzing social and political change. In this public lecture series, local, national, and international speakers will explore various approaches to video games, tabletop games, and tarot, including game design, gameplay, and fan cultures, to examine how gaming cultures, on the one hand, perpetuate bias and problematic power dynamics, and on the other, are capable of intervening in discourses of oppression, heteronormativity, and settler colonialism. We have also commissioned local artists, Sarah Draws a Crowd, to live draw the events and provide a graphic recording of our time together. Her drawings will be projected in real time when possible and will be compiled at the end of the series, which will be hosted on our website as another form of documentation. I'm very excited to introduce today's speaker, John Ayliff, who is an independent game developer who creates text-based games using Twine. Before going independent, he worked in the game industry as a massively multiplayer online role-playing game content developer. I've been teaching with Twine for years, but I've never had a professional step in to talk about it. So I look very much forward to what I'm going to learn today and how I can expand my teaching using text-based gaming. John, please join us here and take it from here.
Hi.
There we go.
Hi, welcome to Interactive Fiction and Twine. I'm John Ayliff. I had about me thing prepared, but Biz just said it all. I got my start in games working on RuneScape, which is a massively multiplayer online game. In 2015, I moved to Canada and became an independent developer. In 2017, I launched my game Seedship, which became like a very minor viral hit for like 1 month. In 2022, I launched my biggest game beyond the Chiron Gate, which was an attempt to take Seedship and make it into something big enough that I could have people to pay for it. I picked text-based games as a medium because after working as part of a big team for so long, I wanted to create something on my own, and that was something I could do despite my lack of artistic talent. I'm also a writer, and so working in the intersection of literature and games was something I found interesting. So in this game, I'm going to talk about the history of text games and interactive fiction and the differences between those terms. Then I'm going to talk about Twine specifically, and then I'm going to talk a bit about my own games. So there are two terms, text-based games and interactive fiction, and I am guilty of using these terms interchangeably. In fact, there isn't really a hard line between them. It is a sliding scale. If you've got something that's about solving puzzles, and maybe there's a flimsy story justification of it, but mostly you're exploring a dungeon and fighting enemies and collecting loot and solving puzzles, or something else where you're mostly navigating the environment, especially if you're scoring points and if there is a world model where the game is about a fictional, like a simulated space, you're probably talking about a text-based game. if the focus is on the story and it's maybe a story where you can influence the outcome of it, or maybe even a story where you're just exploring a preset story through interaction. And if it's using literary techniques, it's probably interactive fiction. But in between those two extremes, there's a whole lot of things where, like, it's telling a detail that involves story, but you're solving puzzles to get through the story, or you're exploring a dungeon or a space station or whatever, and collecting loot and fighting monsters, but there's a very elaborate story attached to that. And also the same tools are used to make these two things, and the same community is making and playing them. So they're not really separate things. Another thing is that the term interactive fiction was kind of coined in the 1980s as a way of asking for the medium to be taken seriously. It's a little bit like some people would want to say graphic novels rather than comic books, because one has a connotation of more seriousness. I think now by 2025, we take games as a medium seriously enough that you don't need to pretend your text-based dungeon crawl is interactive fiction to get it taken seriously, but the term remains, and so a lot of things that are really games are still called interactive fiction. So another kind of axis where you can divide them is parser-based and choice-based interactive fiction. So parser-based fiction is where you get some text output and then you type in a command. And in the old school games, this will usually be go north, take lamp, kill dragon, and so forth. And so when games started in like the university computer labs of the 70s, this was the only way you interacted with the computers. It gave you some output on the screen, or maybe even on a teletype machine, and you would type in commands. Whereas choice-based games are about clicking on links, usually clicking on links on the screen, and that I'll talk about later. So this is one of the first pieces of what would later be called interactive fiction. This was 1977, where the term hadn't been invented. So in that sense, this was definitely a text-based game. And so this is a game called Zork. So I'm going to read a little bit out of this. You are in the kitchen of a White House. A table seems to have been used recently for the preparation of food. A passage leads to the west, and a dark staircase can be seen leading upward. A dark chimney leads down, and to the east is a small window which is open. Now, this is a very functional description. It's all about exactly what you can see, exactly what you can see in each compass direction, and what you can do here. And that's because this game and this kind of game was mostly about a simulated space that you could navigate around with compass directions, and you can pick up and manipulate items. And what had basically happened was the first edition of Dungeons and Dragons came out in 1974. And then a whole lot of computer nerds wanted to find a way to simulate Dungeons and Dragons on their big university mainframe computers. And so you got a lot of games that were about navigating a castle or a dungeon and scoring points by collecting treasure. And the more advanced one would let you fight monsters, but that was kind of difficult to do at first. And if you, I don't know how well you can see the screenshot, but you can see the commands, which are the text after the little greater than signs. And so this kind of game, you navigate by typing in go north, take lamp, but the commands you can see here are actually single letters. I brings up your inventory, so your list of items you're carrying. E is a shorthand for go east. U is a shorthand for go up. So even from the very early days, although the theory was you could type in commands in natural language and the game would know what you wanted to do, in practice, they had a very prescribed set of things you could type in, and which maybe made them a little inaccessible to outsiders. They were played by their own community, and it's hard without instructions to pick up one of these games and just know what to do. So that kind of game, it began as like amateur ever since the 70s. For a while in the 80s, they were commercially viable, and you would get parser interactive fiction on bestseller games lists. by like the end of the 80s, game players were expecting graphics in their games, and so parser interactive fiction dropped off as a commercially viable thing, but there continued to be a small but active fan community making and playing these games. And so it wasn't super accessible to outsiders because it had so many genre conventions that you had to be part of the community to know. But on the other hand, those genre conventions meant that people could start doing quite artistic or maybe literary things with them. So on the left here, we have Galatea by Emily Short, and that takes the medium of parser interactive fiction and makes it into a conversation with a single, very complex and well fleshed out character. So what that does is, rather than modeling objects as physical things you could pick up and move around the space, objects here are conversation topics. So you can say, ask about clothes, ask about owners up there, and the character will respond. On the right, we have Photopia by Adam Cadron, which at first glance looks like the kind of game where you're navigating a space and solving puzzles. But when you play it, you realize there aren't really any puzzles as barriers. You're always led through the linear story of the game. And the puzzle, such as it is the same kind of puzzle you get from reading a complex novel. You're piecing together what the disparate parts of the story are adding up to. And that's kind of a mental puzzle for you, but it's not like you type in the solution into the game and get a screen telling you won. It's like a literary puzzle. Oh, and a quick note, Galatea on the left is green because the interpreter running it happens to have green text. Photopia is red because it is one of very few games that actually use text color as an artistic device. So at about the same time in the 80s, there were choose your own adventure books happening. And so those are books where you read a passage, and at the end of it, it would say, if you want to do this thing, turn to this page. If you want to do that thing, turn to that page. This is an excerpt from Flight from the Dark, a game book by Joe Deaver. This is actually from a web implementation of that game, but it is a completely faithful adaptation of the print book. It even has like the passage numbers. And so this, like the parser-based games, was heavily influenced by Dungeons and Dragons. They would usually be stories where you were some kind of hero or warrior in a fantasy world fighting monsters, collecting treasure. Especially so-called game books, where as well as turning to different pages, they would ask you to record numbers or bits of text describing your character and what they were carrying. So here you see the first option there is, you've got three options. One is to go take the path left, one is to take the path right, and one says, if you wish to use your Kai discipline of Sixth Sense, turn to 141. And what that refers to is, before you started even playing the game proper, you would make your character and pick the set of disciplines, that is kind of magic powers your character has. And if you have a certain one, you can turn to page 141. But of course, there's nothing stopping you, if you have a print book, from cheating by turning to this page, even if you don't have the discipline. So even without like modern tools, even without like the web as a paradigm for clicking on links, you can see how this would be pretty easy to implement on a computer. And on a computer, you could make sure the player can't cheat by turning to 141 if they don't have the Kai discipline of Sixth Sense. But that actually wasn't done very much, because the kind of players who would want that, I think, they were starting to be catered to by graphical role-playing games where you're like, can see the monsters you're fighting in the dungeon. And so that kind of went off into graphical role-playing games and out of the scope of this talk. Parser-based interactive fiction would sometimes switch into this mode for dialogue where you type, talk to so-and-so, and it would bring up numbered list of conversation topics. But for the most part, interactive fiction as a genre was using typed in commands. This is one of my own games. I include it here not because I think it's particularly worthy of study, but because I wrote it as a pastiche of the game books we saw in the last page. And it's just to show that it's exactly the same thing. The only difference is that they're at the bottom are links you click on rather than pages you turn to. So one way, and one perfectly valid way of making choice-based interactive fiction is to have a passage of text followed by links. But if you're working in Twine or a web-based medium, you can also embed links in the body of the text. So this is a screenshot of the game Howling Dogs by a creator called Porpentine. And here you can see, this is a description of a room. It says the activity room is in the north wall, the lavatory entrance west, next to the trash disposal and the nutrient dispensers. The sanity room is in the east wall. Her photograph is pinned to the side of your bunk. A red LCD reads 367 a few inches over. And things like activity room, lavatory, trash disposal are in blue text, indicating those are links. And so it's pretty obvious, even before you start playing, that clicking on a link here would mean going in a certain direction or interacting with an object. The same kind of things you can do in a game like Zork, where where it's got a world model with a space you can navigate and items you can interact with. That's just doing the same kind of thing, but with links. But in this game, later on in the game, the creator uses links in a lot of different ways. So there are passages which are quite linear, and it'll give you some paragraphs of story with just one link at the end to go to the next one. There are parts where you're clicking a link to choose a dialogue option for your character to say. There is one very, for me, memorable section where there's a passage of text where like every other word is a link, and like that creates a feeling of sensory overload. So choice-based games that let you put links anywhere you like open up artistic possibilities that choose your own adventure books couldn't do. So this game was written in Twine. It was one of the first major games to be written in Twine and helped to make Twine known in the interactive fiction community. So one reason that parser-based interactive fiction had dominated the like interactive fiction medium up until like around 2010 was that there were a lot of mature and well-supported tools for making parser interactive fiction. Is in particular Inform, which had been reverse engineered from games from the system used by one company to make games in the 80s. But at the time, there were no good free tools to make choice-based interactive fiction. If you could make a website, you could, of course, make different web pages and links between them, and you'd make that tell a story. But if you wanted to do anything more complex, like remembering whether the player had the kind of discipline of Sixth Sense, there was no easy way to do that until the creation of Twine in 2009 by Chris Klimas. Twine 1 was a downloadable app. Twine 2 in 2014 was even easier to use because it was a web-based editor, so you could start making a story in it without even downloading a thing. Although there is a downloadable version of it, and I do recommend you do that, download it if you want to make anything you care about, because when I say a web-based editor, I don't mean something like Google Docs where your story lives on a server and you can access it from anywhere. For the web-based editor, the story lives in your browser cookies, and if you accidentally clear them, you have completely lost your story. So do download the app version and save your stories to your disk so you don't lose them. So what Twine did, because it was the because it was so easy to use and it was free and there was almost no barrier to entry, it put games creation and interactive fiction creation in the reach of creators who weren't really represented either in the interactive fiction community with its like parser-based go north, take lamp, or in the or in mainstream graphical games. So it put games in the hands of creators who were maybe from marginalized communities or wanted to tell stories like other than the colonialist power fantasies most games told. Those of you who listened to Anna Antropy's talk last week will have heard a bit about that, and I don't really have anything to add to that, except a personal anecdote. In 2021, I released a game called Cyborg Arena, which was using like the sci-fi cliche or trope of creating like a fictional marginalized group in order to tell stories about oppression in like an abstract sense. My cyborgs weren't meant to stand in for any particular group of people. It was like a fictional thought experiment, but lots of people who commented on the game assumed I was telling a story about trans people, and which is a valid interpretation of my game. It's not what I was going for, but I think the fact that people went there so quickly shows that Twine had become so associated with marginalized and queer and especially trans creators that by that point it had become almost a cliche. So this is a look at the Twine interface. This is my current work in progress, which I'm not going to talk about, but you can, but the model is that each of those squares is a passage of text, which could be a sentence or many paragraphs. The lines are links between the passages. These arrows will go one way, but you could also make passages that you can link to from both directions, in which case arrows would go both ways. If you edit the text of a passage, you make a link just by putting text in double square brackets, and that lets you create a new passage to link to. So that is the very basics of how Twine works. And that is not a difficult paradigm to get your head around. It's learning to make something in Twine doesn't really require coding experience. It just requires being able to think in terms of a nonlinear story. So it is easy to pick up. It's also very flexible and extensible. And another way it differs from the tools being used to make parser interactive fiction was that it doesn't assume anything about the game you're trying to make. Parser interactive fiction tools, where you're making games where you are going in compass directions and taking items, they are built on the assumption that you have a world model that is a simulated space with discrete locations and items that can exist in those locations, and maybe characters you can move around between those locations. And you can use those tools to make other kinds of stories, and some people have, but you're kind of fighting against what the tool was intended for. But Twine doesn't make those kind of assumptions. Since Twine appeared in 2009, other similar systems have appeared. And I'll just mention a couple. On the left is Choice Script. This is a screenshot from one of my favorite stories, Choice of Robots. So Choice Script was created by the company called Choice of Games to make their own games in, but they released it as a free tool for anyone to use. On the right is a screenshot from 80 Days by Inkle. And again, it's written in an in-house tool called Ink, but again, this tool's been released for anyone to use. Both these tools are less flexible than Twine and are meant for a more specific kind of story that's more like the old game book, where you'd have a passage of text followed by discrete links. I think Ink is a little more flexible than Choice Script, but they're both, the paradigm is that you have some text followed by some links. and they both can't really do graphics. The graphics in the screenshot on the right, they're I'm pretty sure they're generated by the game that the ink story is embedded in, not something that ink itself can do. But these were both commercial games that were sold. So like I said, commercial interactive fiction was a thing in the 1980s for a while. Then it became so that you couldn't sell a game unless it had graphics. But in the last 10 years or so, there's been a resurgence of interactive fiction, this time of choice-based interactive fiction, mostly that you play on an e-reader or on your phone. And it's being sold both to people who play games and people who read books and maybe would like an interactive book you can read on your e-reader. So more about Twine. I think what the thing I like most about Twine is that it's very easy to pick up, but you could also do progressively more advanced things with it. So on the very basic end, you've got passages and links. And you can do a lot with them. The game I showed you earlier, Howling Dogs, I think there is some variable tracking under the hood, but mostly it's getting its effect just through passages and links in the default formatting of Twine. So you can do a lot with just the very basic stuff Twine can do. Then there is basic formatting like bolding, italicizing text. To do anything more advanced, though, means you get into story formats, which is something that's maybe not intuitive to outsiders. This is where Twine starts to get complicated because Twine itself doesn't do much besides like passages and links and basic formatting. But each Twine story is written in one story format. And the story formats are extensions of Twine that firstly determine the default appearance of the story, which you can override if you know about HTML and CSS. But more importantly, the story format gives you a set of macros, which is a coding language that you can use to extend the functionality of Twine. And this is what you'd use to record variables and like an example earlier, record whether the player has the discipline of sixth sense and only show the link if they do. But this means that the answer to how do I do such and such a thing in Twine is almost always, it depends what story format you're using. So if you are looking for help online, and especially if you're asking for help on forums, you need to specify which story format you're using or people will be annoyed. So what the story format lets you use is variables affect code flow, like only letting you go to a certain place if you have the key or something. And you can also use variables to insert values into the text, like letting the player enter their name at the start of the game and at the end having the villain taunt them by name. And you can also add random values, like create a random number or choose a word from a list of random words and use that as a value for a variable. And if you and you can take that, and that's all you need to do procedural generation, where you generate random values and put them in variables and use that to randomly generate a space to walk around or randomly generate a description out of bits of text. Going slightly more advanced, you can add images and audio to a Twine story. The Stephen story formats have their own ways of doing that. If you do know HTML and CSS, you can use them to override the default formatting of a Twine story and make it look like anything you can make a website look like. If you know JavaScript, you can add JavaScript to your story and do more complicated kinds of code than your story format could do on its own. The way I think most often you'd use that is you define a function in JavaScript and then have your story format code call that to do a complicated calculation and then use the value output from that to make decisions in the game. And finally, in my own development, I I have actually transcended Twine itself and used something called Twigo, which lets you write your passages in a text editor like I use Notepad++, but you could use any programming type text editor. And then Twigo is a command line compiler that takes your text files and makes a Twine story out of them. So you can use the programming techniques that are enabled by using a fully featured text editor, but you sacrifice the boxes and arrows story map of a Twine story. So a bit about story formats. There are two most widely used ones, I think by a big margin, are Harlow and SugarCube. Harlow is the Twine 2 default and is lightweight, but you can do a bunch of things. And because it's the default, I recommend sticking to it unless you've got some good reason to switch. SugarCube is based on what was the default for Twine 1 and is a little uglier and hard to use, but is more flexible and capable of more advanced things. So if you're going to do complex coding, and I think especially if you want to do the thing where I said, where you make a JavaScript function and delve down into that, you should look into switching from Harlow to SugarCube. There are also others, including Snowman and Chapbook, which I honestly don't know much about, because I think most Twine developers will pick a favorite story format and stick with it. And I'm a SugarCube guy and have not really looked at the others because it works well for me. So I apologize in advance if you ask me how to do something and I only know how to do it in SugarCube, not Harlow. Okay, so those of you here for the GMST 475 class will have been assigned to play my game Seedship, I think. And so this is a screenshot from that. So I'm going to talk a bit about it. So those of you who haven't played it, the premise of the game is you are the computer in control of a spaceship that contains the cryogenically frozen last 1,000 members of the human race after the Earth has been destroyed. So a fairly dark premise. And your task is to find a planet to found a new colony on. And how that works is you get given a planet which is randomly generated like this one, and you can choose either to move on or found a colony. And usually you want to move on because most of the planets are a bit terrible. And if you move on, you get a random event which will usually damage some of your ship systems, which you can see listed on the right, all those numbers, or the left rather. And sometimes you get a choice of to damage one system or the other, but in general, those numbers are going to be tending downwards throughout the game. And eventually, when you've found a good enough planet, you click on Found Colony, and then the game stops being interactive. You just get the click through some pages of text, which are the story of your colony and how it got founded. And how well the colony does is based both on the planet you're settling on, and also on your surviving ship systems. So the game mechanic is about pushing your luck and seeing how good a planet you can find before your ship is degraded enough that even a good planet won't save you. So Seedship is atypical for a Twine game. If you think back to the text-based games, interactive fiction scale I showed you earlier, this one sits very close to the text-based games end of the scale. It's based on the gameplay loop where you repeatedly see a planet and then get a random event, which most interactive fiction isn't. It uses tracking of stats to a larger extent and shows you those stats rather than keeping them under the hood. It uses random generation to a much greater extent than most games. And another thing that makes it very gamey is the shareable final score. So at the end of the game, you get the story of your colony and a numeric score, and you can share those things. Originally, there was a link to share it on Twitter and Facebook. Eventually, I got fed up of those platforms and changed it so there's just a link you can copy and paste into whatever social media, so I don't have to worry about social media changing in the future. But I think one of the things that both makes it very much in the game into the scale and that helped it to go a bit viral is that you could share your score, both to share your unique little story and to compete for a numeric high score. Let's go back this slide I skipped. How do you go back? Oh. Yes, this is the story map of Seedship. It looks a bit uglier than the story map I showed you because this is Twine 1, not Twine 2. When I made Seedship, Twine 1 was kind of in its infancy and couldn't yet do the kind of things that Twine 1 could. So I stuck with Twine 1. And so you've got like an ugly gray background and straight rather than curved arrows, but that's what we old Twine developers had to work with back in the day. And this is kind of an example of how the story map becomes misleading to the point of uselessness when you're doing a very gamey thing like Seedship, because the most important parts of the game are just a tiny loop in the upper left middle. And then all these big lot of passages towards the bottom and right are the different random events you get as you move between systems. But just one or two passages in the middle there account for the more than half the playtime of the game. So this is a way story maps can be misleading for a complicated game like this. Okay, so oops, back to the final score. This is my way of getting into games for social justice and games to say something political, because what Seedship does is it gives you a score based on how good a colony you found it, and that included assigning different point values to different political systems. And I tried to do that based on what I hoped were universal values, like equality is better than inequality, democracy better than dictatorship, peace better than war. But you can't, even if you're vague like that, you can't make a game like that without making some kind of political point with it. And even more so when you get into the mechanics of interacting with aliens. Some of the planets you find will have aliens already living on them, and you get a score bonus or penalty based on how your colonists end up interacting with them, which is something you as a player can't directly control because this is in the non-interactive colony founding stage. And so I played Seedship for like ages to try and get a good screenshot, and I in the end got one where you get 0 for your native relations. But if you end up with peaceful and productive contact with them, you get a score bonus. If you end up going to war with them, you get a score penalty, regardless of who wins the war. And this is a kind of clear example of something where you can imagine the game making a very different political point without changing any of its text, just by changing the score values you get for different ways you could end up interacting with aliens. Like if I'd been a different kind of person, I could have written a game where you get a score bonus for wiping out the aliens and a score penalty for letting their culture contaminate yours, without changing the game text at all. So this is my theory I came up with when writing this talk about how games can have a message. There's what the game tells you in its text, which is the same thing that a novel or a piece of non-interactive artwork can do. But there is also what you allow the player to do and what you reward the player for. So in Seedship, the set of verbs you have, the things you are allowed to do as a player is pretty limited. You just can move on and found a colony. You can't like mine planets or terraform them or fight against hostile aliens. And then in Seedship, very clearly, you get different point values based on what I, the author, think of different political systems. Um, so I'm going to talk now a bit about my my other big game beyond the Chiron Gate. When I set out to make Seedship, my original idea was to make a big, sprawling game about exploring space, where you would explore different randomly generated planets, and you could do all sorts of things like make aliens and manage your crew and manage your spaceship. And Seedship was what happened when I realized I had to condense that right down into a much more focused idea. So the game development tip from that is keep your scope limited to make a good game. But then I ignored my own lesson and decided to make my big sprawling space exploration game anyway. And the result was Beyond the Chiron Gate, where you manage a team of explorers on a spaceship and you fly around a procedurally generated universe and get all sorts of random events. You can explore space. And this here is a screenshot of the game at its most interactive fiction. Like, you've got a situation where there's like you're in orbit and can see an electromagnetic storm on the planet. You get some options where you can have your pilot fly the ship into the storm to gather data, or you could have your engineer build a remote probe, or you could just enjoy the show. And these are surrounded by some interface elements that make it more gamey, more to the game end of the scale. So after each option, there's a percentage chance of success. At the start of each option, the icons representing that you have that option because you have a pilot or an engineer. At the top of the screen, there are the numbers representing the resources you have in the game. On the left are different tabs you can click on to get even more information about the game. But strip that all away, what you've essentially got is the same as a choose your own adventure book, where you have a situation and several discrete options to pick from. Here's a screenshot of the game in another kind of mode. This is a procedurally generated planet description where the game is generated a planet represented by variables in the game, and then it uses that to spit out chunks of text about that planet, and then it makes some of those bits of text into links that you can click on to explore those features. So it's behaving more like the screenshot of the howling dogs I showed you, where links represent things you can do in a space, but they're embedded in the text, not at the end. And finally, here's the crew of your ship, where each one has name and pronouns and their little bio and their skill level, which determines their chance of success at doing things and what's affecting them right now. And so based on my lessons from Seedship, I was to try to be very deliberate when making Chiron Gate about what I was saying with the game, not because I had like a point I wanted to make on my game development soapbox, but because I was conscious that all art is political or has some kind of message, including games. And if you aren't aware of what your game is saying, you're probably just like unconsciously reinforcing the status quo. So for Beyond the Chiron Gate, I set out to make a non-colonialist game about exploration. And I don't know if that's really possible or if I succeeded, but it's what I was going for. And the main way I did that was in, so you look here, was in picking what I allowed the player to do. So you never have the option to do things like mine planets for resources or set up colonies on them. And your ship is unarmed. And in the rare occasions where you get into like trouble, your only options are to talk out of it or run away. If you land on a planet and talk to aliens and accidentally insult them and they tell you to leave, the game forces you to do that. It doesn't give you an option to stick around. less obviously than in Seedship, because it doesn't place so much emphasis on the final score, but it also does reward the player for doing things I think are in line with a kind of vaguely Star Trek type utopian exploration for the sake of exploration story, where your final score is based on the amount of data you gathered, which is like an abstract resource you're collecting. And it's also like a Star Trek type setting where I'm trying to depict my own idea of a utopian post-scarcity future. And I did that mostly through the character bios, where your information you get about your crew gives little hints about what kind of world they're from. So it's common for your crew members to have previously worked at something they call the Earth Restoration Project, by which I was trying to imply that like it's a big geoengineering project to make the Earth habitable again after climate change. Similarly, there are people working on the like Mars terraforming project. No one you can recruit is for the military, even though in the real world, if you would like recruit people for a space mission, one place you'd get them from is like the Air Force. But I wanted to imply a peaceful future, like where there isn't any military anymore, which maybe isn't super realistic. It's more idealized than realistic, but it did well for the kind of hint-based storytelling I was going for. I probably wouldn't have made this world if I was setting a novel in it. So that's what I was trying to do. I don't know how well it succeeded, but it's more of an effort. So I'm nearly out of time. So conclusion, text games and interactive fiction are basically the same thing with different emphases, and they've been around since the 1970s. Choice-based games began as game books in the 80s, but they are currently having a kind of resurgence, and both as like hobby art projects released for free and as commercial projects released by big companies, and lots of shades in between those things. Twine has since 2009 put the game creation in the hands of amateurs and others not represented by mainstream games. And all games are saying something, whether they intend to or not. So as a developer, it's important to be aware of what you're saying and be deliberate about how you're doing that. So that's the end of the talk, and I think we have some time for questions.
Thank you so much for that talk. I learned a lot about what Twine can do, especially on a more formal level that integrates programming experience, of which I have none. But from the questions that I received via the students, I can see that some people really do understand how they could potentially do some really interesting things with Twine. So I'd like to start with the students, if anybody would like to ask their question aloud, or if I just, in fact, should read them from our submission portal. Okay, I shall do that. One moment. So we had some really interesting questions around player, where is the one I was thinking about? Around the lack of visuals with some text-based storytelling. And somebody was saying when they were playing Seedship, they realized that they really hadn't played a game without visuals before. And they admired how the game was able to keep them engaged and excited while not having visuals, only text. And they wanted to know if you had any tips for keeping a game interesting in that sense, since so many video games these days are known for their visuals in particular.
To some extent, you use the same techniques you use when writing prose fiction. So like what makes a good description in a novel would maybe make a good description in a game, but only to a certain extent, because the mindset you're in when you're interacting with a game is different from the mindset you're in when you're reading a book. Something you've got to bear in mind is the pace of it and how long a player is spending on a particular passage of text. In general, you want to keep everything like, you want to have your game establish its own rhythm. It's fine. Some games will give you like a whole chapter of text and give you one choice. Some games will give you like a few paragraphs with choices like that you're probably making every few seconds in real time. And neither is better than the other, but you need to decide which you're doing and establish the game's own rhythm. And then you can do things like in Beyond the Chiron Gate, for that like big plot events, I deliberately wrote a significantly longer than usual passage of text to slow the game down and make the player think about it. And for games that are like gamey, where you expect a player to replay them, this isn't probably applicable to something like an interactive novel that you only expect player to read through once. But for games where your player is likely to read the text multiple times, you've got to write text with them skim reading it after already kind of knowing what it says in mind. And so maybe highlight the most important words or make sure it's super clear. And if this text is different from the last time they saw text like this, you need to like highlight that in some way. Otherwise, they will assume it's exactly the same and just skim over it.
It's interesting that you're still advocating for using the visual qualities of text. But I mean, it's how I write emails these days.
Think about the tools you're using.
Yeah.
If you are using choice script, then you are pretty much locked into a choose your own adventure book where you write it exactly as if you're writing a novel, and but with choices. Although some of them do interesting things with like very short passages. If you're writing a game where you can put links in the body of the text, then the placement and number and density of links is an artistic device you can use.
Yeah. I think there was a question about the density of links in my collection of questions here, but I wanted to move on to another question around the role AI might play in the evolution of video game narrative structures, and how it might impact the structures to keep player choices while telling an engaging story.
Okay, so by AI, you mean something like ChatGPT or whatever?
Yes.
My games, Seedship and Chiron Gate, they use procedural generation, which is where like there is an algorithm under the hood putting together a bit of text out of fragments of text I've written for it. This is not the same thing as something like ChatGPT coming with the text. In fact, I would say it is antithetical to that. When you are making a proc-gen game, you are hand creating the algorithm. You know, because you made the algorithm and you worked it out mathematically, you know what it can and cannot output and how likely different outputs are. If you're using generative AI as part of your game to output something, then it's a black box. You as a developer don't know what it's going to output. You can't be certain it'll output something that's coherent and not offensive. You can't really claim that you as a developer wrote that text. I do not think that generative AI has any legitimate future in games or any kind of art. I think it is built on plagiarism. It is extremely bad for the environment. It is fundamentally artistically bankrupt. I would never touch it. I would never touch a game that's used it. It is possible, I don't know how you technically do it, but I think it's probably possible to make a Twine game that incorporates generative AI. And of course, it's possible to get ChatGPT to output some text in a font and then copy and paste that into your Twine story. But please don't. Why should I, as a human being, play a game that a human being hasn't even been bothered to write?
That is a fantastic note to end on. I had another question lined up, but I think these questions will
Oh,
also
okay.
be really rewarding in the workshop section
Sure. Yeah,
of
I'm very
today's
happy to answer
program.
questions in the workshop. And
Yeah.
if we don't have time for them, if you want to email me questions, I
Yeah.
can try and answer them.
Yeah, I'll email you the collection of questions,
do.
even just to see how the students are responding to the work that you are sharing with us. But in the interim, as we transition back to our classroom, let's give you, John, another round of applause. Thank you so much for sharing your work. And for those of you that joined us online, thank you for joining us today. We will now move into an exclusively in-person portion of our programming.